The governor of California is a young man whose father was also governor, the interregnum having been presided over by Ronald Reagan. He defeated his opponent narrowly in a race ignored by the majority of California's voters. Even so, although his term of office is less than a year old, Governor Brown is scoring record approval at the polls. And the question is, how is he accomplishing this? A question that vexes and fascinates professional political observers. His educational background is well known. He spent a half-dozen years as a Jesuit seminarian, but left to study Greek and Latin at Berkeley, then on to Yale for a law degree. Returning to California, he practiced law briefly, then ran for office in Los Angeles, then for Secretary of State of California, in the exercise of which office he proved adept at attracting the attention of the press. And then in 1974, the governorship. His politics has been a combination of an ascetic personal style and even unorthodox gestures towards public frugality, plus a highly developed public contempt for the most popular public hobgoblins, vile objects like oil companies, big business, that sort of thing. But neither conservatives nor liberals have found much structure shoring up what his critics call a politics of day-by-day improvisation and what his admirers call the new politics that issue from the refreshing desire to break free from all the old constricting forms and to ask basic questions about the purpose of government and indeed the purpose of man on earth. We're supposed to focus on the question of the practical limits of liberalism, and I should like to begin by asking Governor Brown a very routine question, whether he considers that busing for the purpose of achieving racial integration is an example of an impractical extension of liberal programming.
I think, as you indicated about liberalism, it has its practical limitations that are becoming more manifest. And much of what the superintendent here in California, Wilson Ryle, says about the inherent problems of busing and its limitations as an educational tool, I'd subscribe to.
Well, does that mean that you would back a federal form of relief against the form of judicial imposition that
I would leave it to the courts.
Sees it?
I don't see it as a
Why would you leave legislation to the courts?
Because it's a doctrine that's developing, and I think that in an area as complex and as volatile and as already in point and in place, that I think the courts are handling it. The Supreme Court has taken a rather tortuous course and is quite capable in dealing with this thing on a precedent-by-precedent basis. The people are able to make their appeal right through the federal courts up to the U.S. Supreme Court. It is not clear right now what the ultimate resolution is going to be, and I sense a shifting in the mood, certainly here in California and probably throughout the country, that leaves it in that arena where it can best be handled. That to me seems a very rational way to leave what is obviously a very polarizing situation.
Well, the courts have relied almost exclusively on the 14th Amendment for authority in this entire field, and the 14th Amendment specifies that Congress shall pass appropriate legislation to enforce its provisions. So how do you, as a lawyer, take it on yourself to revise the Constitution, or is this a part of the famous spontaneity of your administration?
Well, you're talking about Section 5 of the 14th Amendment, which has had a very murky history as exactly what was intended. And if you go back and read the discussions...
This implies I haven't recently read it, right?
Well, no, I'm not implying that. Maybe that was a rhetorical way of prefacing my answer and buying a little more time while I find what I want to say. But the fifth, Section 5, which I think it is, has never been used very much, and they've left it to the courts. The fact is, the whole issue under Brown versus Board of Education was to get at the intolerable situation of segregated schooling, where you were excluding a group of people in this country from equal treatment in the most important facet of their young lives, which is education. Now, it was perceived in one way in 1954. It's developed over time, and the question now between de facto and de jure segregation, the decisional law that is emerging, I think is a more competent method of dealing with the problem than to try to lock in some legislative solution at this point. The judges have gone one way, have gone another. The law is in flux, and I would rather place my confidence in this very difficult issue with the Supreme Court, because there's no doubt that in places there's de jure segregation, which requires extraordinary remedies. On the other hand, I think now, whether it be Mr. Coleman or Mr. Riles, a number of other thoughtful observers, don't believe that some of the explanations that were given for the original decisions justify the wide-scale busing that has been required in the lower courts. So I would leave this to the sound discretion of the judiciary, and let's watch it a while longer and see what happens.
You wouldn't leave it to the unsound discretion of the judiciary?
Well, that's a phrase that lawyers generally use. Whenever the word
When you want to make
discretion
time
is
with the
used,
court.
you usually preface it with the word sound, and maybe that's more of a hope than a description. But,
well, it's kind of a ritualism, but I understand it. Let me ask you, may I say two things? One.
And I might say that that very issue right now is pending before the California Supreme Court, and I'm sure they will wrestle with it and deal with it, and when that occurs, I think it'll be soon enough to react to it.
But of course their authority is sharply limited by the federal court, which interprets its own authority as overruling the California's authority on this particular issue. But let me point out that as recently, just to clarify that point, as recently as, 5-6 years ago, the Congress of the United States, in order to enforce votes for people without reference to race, color, or creed, deprived individual states that had a record of malpractice on this point of the right to superintend their own elections. So here was a clear reliance on the authority of the 14th Amendment exercised by the Congress for the sake of effecting a broad constitutional purpose. So it isn't as though the provision I'm talking about is a dead letter. But now, what distresses me...
You're talking about a legislative implementation in the, I think that was the Civil Rights Act in 1965.
Renewed last year.
That was Title VI.
Yeah, renewed well, was it?
That was the one that allows the head of HEW to withhold funds where the law is not...
No, that's not the one I'm talking about. It's the one that deprived, for a period of 10 years, any state that had a record of depriving people on account of race of equal access to the polls, of the right to impose a literacy test. Now, this was renewed last year. Now, irrespective of the merits of it, we have here a historical precedent of the legislature coming to the rescue of the Constitution.
Well, I don't deny that that authority may be there, but basically, in this situation, I think the courts can handle it. I think the accumulated wisdom that is certainly accumulating will make its weight in the U.S. Supreme Court, and I prefer to leave it there.
But the Supreme Court is not a legislative body, and when I talked about the practical limits of liberalism, I didn't think you would go so far as to say that we ought to permit the Supreme Court to relieve Congress of its essential responsibilities. In the first place, the courts have not handled it. The situation in Boston is a court-dominated situation, and it's chaotic. In what sense can you say that this poor Judge Garrity has handled a situation in which virtually civil war has broken out? But it is manifestly, as the Supreme Court itself told us for a period of a century, that some problems are legislative and political in character, others are judicial, and I'm surprised that because you shrink from asking the legislature to do what you and Wilson Ryle think ought to be done, that you somehow hope that 9 justices of the Supreme Court
well, first of all,
will arrogate the authority.
To try to define with simplicity, the difference between legislative and judicial, isn't really possible. And in this particular situation, we have a growing body of precedent, very much in the tradition of the common law, that goes from decision to decision. And instead of trying to start with a solution already locked up, this is a solution that is certainly changing over time and developing. So the courts are in the middle of this, and the Congress is free to attempt very many its own particular remedies. So far it has not been able to do that, and the courts intervening in this has been a stimulus. Now, certainly not every district judge that has lifetime tenure throughout the United States is going to always be possessed of the full wisdom necessary for a problem like this. The judges now are supervising the prisons, they're supervising the schools, they're really overseeing many of our institutions, and I recognize the very difficult question that raises for a democracy, and quite frankly my own feelings about the passive virtues on the judiciary are changing. Certainly I thought that that was the place where many of these things could be corrected, and I'm beginning to have some question about the wisdom of the isolated judiciary arrogating to themselves so many of the social problems of our time.
Mm-hmm.
This particular one, involving as it does a fundamental right and the background of it, I think is being handled at least at the level of the Supreme Court. But there are other areas, quite frankly, where I've, particularly in the prison area, there was some legislation here in California to lock into a particular law the discipline, when you could put someone in segregation, when you set his term. I vetoed those bills, and I vetoed them because I felt that some things are not susceptible to a premature codification of principle, and I would prefer to leave it to the sound discretion of the people who are dealing with it on a day-by-day basis. And if a clear principle emerges, then it's time enough to codify these things.
But premature crystallizations can do a lot of harm.
They can do a great deal of harm.
But let me, before we get off the subject of Supreme Court, ask a question that I think, well, I won't say would interest you uniquely, but would interest you more than a lot of people I know who are governors, and that is the extraordinary extent to which the Supreme Court has, especially in the last 20 or 30 years, somehow acceded to a position of moral authority. It seems to be an arbiter not of what the Constitution says, but of what we ought to believe. I'll give you an example. George McGovern, during the primary fight in 1972, was asked what he thought about busing. He happened to be asked that question in a state that was opposed to busing, black and white alike. And he said, well, I think we should do what the Supreme Court tells us that we should do. He said, I incline against it as a solution. But of course, if the Supreme Court says it has to be done, that's the end of the question. The answer is, of course, that it's not the end of the question. It's the end of the question of what the Supreme Court says the Constitution should be done. But we ought to be left, ought we not, with the alternative of overruling the Supreme Court by constitutional amendment.
That is a very
really
drastic alternative.
I know, but aren't they asking really for something like internal assent? They're asking us to treat the Supreme Court more or less as Catholics are asked to treat the papacy.
Well, that seems to be changing too. The doctrine of what is ex cathedra and what is not is rather difficult to define. It used to be everly encyclical,
yes,
and now it's very hard to identify what is subject to the doctrine of infallibility and what isn't.
Yes, but the Pope's sanctions are impalpable.
Impalpable?
Yeah.
Oh, in other words, they're in the internal form rather than the external.
And the Supreme Court can put us in jail and has, but
I think the Supreme Court learns also and changes, and I believe that we have an interaction. This is there's an ecology to the legal and political system that we have, and what is done in one part of the organism has an effect on the other, and over time I think we've learned a great deal. And the decision, which I think has been critical and very right, that has put the imprint of integration and equality in our law has been very helpful. And that isn't to say that there aren't a great many difficulties in its implementation, but right now we know a great deal more than we did 20 years ago. And we know that in our central cities, where you have, where the heart of civilization presumably emerges out of, we have a decay setting in where, whether it be academic, welfare, employment, crime, hope, community sense, these things are breaking down, and it is a problem that at the level of symbolism and slogans, it's not going to go away. Now, a school bus is in a very a symbol that generates a great deal of feeling, but the fact is that unless we find a way to integrate the society in a far more profound way, especially in employment and in mutual respect, then this civilization is not going to make it. And the goad of the Supreme Court, to me, is just a challenge for the rest of the institutions in the society to react. And we cannot live half white and half black, or separated. We are one people, even though we are a multiplicity of ethnic and religious and philosophical persuasions. And we are very divided, and we have to find ways to bring us together. And I want to see that through employment, that within the schools we can have exchanges. But the reality now is that with the flight to the suburbs, with the high property taxes, and the whole changing composition, there is a problem that is basically
resegregation. Yeah.
It is and that the courts cannot solve that. That's a problem for the American people. And whether you put kids on a bus and have them ride from one part of the city to the other, we cannot negate the emerging reality that each year the percentage of minority school children is increasing in the major cities of our nation. And that's something that we have to come to terms with, and the neighborhoods are breaking down, and they're breaking down because of the lack of career, the lack of future, the lack of hope that is available to all. And unless we can come to terms with the situation of a society that through technology, through the rising unemployment, through all the shifts that are going on, is depriving more and more people of a stable set of opportunities to live and to contribute to society, I think we're in major trouble. And I think it's a major threat to the continued viability of this country. And I'm not talking just about minorities, I'm talking about old people, I'm talking about building tradesmen. We have to find a structured set of roles and jobs that everyone can aspire to, and and devote his energy and talent to that. And that it's partially schooling. Now, you talk about the court as having practical limitations. I would apply the same observation to schooling.
Yeah, before we get on to that, because I'm very interested in your views on schooling, may I just ask you, is it a fair summary to say that your position is as follows, that a practical limit of liberalism is that when you get into a jam by social schematics that don't work, but which touch on moral points, you've got to have the Supreme Court bail you out, because only the Supreme Court exercises the moral authority to permit reversing a series of commitments made by the legislature.
I would say this, that the Supreme Court has the moral authority.
Why?
To, wait, let me finish what there, I want to give a few predicates to that. It has the moral authority to enshrine for all the people of this country certain principles in a way that the legislative branch cannot. If it does that precipitously or unwisely too often, it will lose that moral authority and become no different than the other branches of government, and will defeat its very purposes.
Was the abortion decision such a usurpation?
Very close. On
what
the
about
merits,
the prayer decision?
The prayer decision?
Saying it was a violation of the First Amendment to
the
permit,
Establishment Clause, that it established religion.
yeah, to permit a New York State prayer, which had been agreed upon by rabbis and Protestant ministers and Catholic priests, to say that it threatened the establishment of religion.
Well, I would say that if you're asking me as a lawyer,
Yeah.
the first prayer decision was more soundly based in precedent than the most recent decision on abortion, which was definitely a leap from anything that happened before, and the delineation of 3 months for one kind of state intervention or non-intervention, 3 months for another, and the final 3 months for...
It was not the kind of mandate of the Supreme Court that John Marshall had in
Very
mind.
difficult to find that. That's getting very close. In fact, that is getting into legislation, because certainly reading the 14th Amendment, you can't find that. And that kind of interventionism certainly looks very close to what all the liberals were complaining about when Justice Vandivanner was asserting the rights of private property in the 30s. We don't discuss now the rights of business. We are now operating on some social theories. And Justice Holmes talked about it was not the role of the Supreme Court to raise to the level of constitutional dignity the social statics of Mr. What's the fellow's name in England?
Sumner.
Sumner, no, that was another.
He's the guy who wrote Social Statics.
Yes. Well, whoever it was, Holmes said they're not there to apply any one social theory, they're there to interpret the Constitution. And certainly you can err from a left-wing position or a right-wing position, and the court's got to be above that. You can't deny the fact that principle, as it impedes and rather impinges in reality, is part of the political process. And it's a matter of degree. It's just a matter of degree, and the court has to exercise wisdom. There's no absolute answer. And the idea that strict constructionism allows you, as Justice Roberts said, to lay the Constitution on one side of the desk and the proposed law under question on the other, and push out an automatic answer like some kind of a slot machine, is just not true, because the people who wrote the abortion decision are so-called strict constructionists. Yet by no stretch of the imagination was that strict constructionism. That was as liberal and as freewheeling as any decision that I've ever read in the entire time I've ever read Supreme Court cases. So the problem with this theory of the Supreme Court is that when the conservatives get their chance, they do their thing, and when the liberals get their chance. Now, in this case, I don't know whether you want to call that decision conservative or not, but it seemed to, it definitely was in the legislative, had that ring of legislation about it.
Yeah.
That, if indulged in too often, I would say certainly undermines the credibility of the court. But I think what the court is doing is they're trying to sense the mood of the country. And it's an interaction. And if you look at the conservative justices, Frankfurter, and those who follow in his school, when they talk about due process, Justice Harlan, for example, he would talk about the outraging the conscience of the race, fundamental fairness. Now, those are very abstract words. Those are basically, if you want to be hard on them, on those phrases, they're verbal cellophane. And so what they're doing is, through this process, trying to sense and articulate the fundamental agreed upon moral principles that this country accepts. And they may be slightly ahead of where the country is going, and maybe they're a little behind. But they try to make these judgments, and in the long run, if they make them right, and if they are wise, they can be a bit ahead of the country. If they guess wrong too many times, either there will be great trouble, or elections occur and new judges are appointed and the balance is righted. But if you look at the history of that court and the history of law itself, one only goes so far before you get too far out of touch with what the people want. Ultimately, in our society, the will of the people and the common interest as shared by most people has its way. There may be a time lag, but in the time of Roosevelt, it didn't take too long before the economic theories that were accepted by the majority of the people had their way. The same is going to be true of social theories. There's only so far 9 men can go. That's what Sidney Hook said, that's what Frankfurter said, that the basic appeal is not to 9 individuals in the long run, it's to the well-armed and well-alerted citizenry. That's the reality, and I think the court is carrying on in the best way they can in a very difficult time. We are in a society where it is very hard to find the consensus. We are fragmenting. We're proliferating at every level of economics and morality and politics, and the court is a unifying mechanism and a beacon of light if it acts wisely. And I think, by and large, given the complexity of our country, the heterogeneity of our people, they're doing an excellent job. And I would not try to second-guess this or that decision, because I have complete confidence that over time, that through the changing of presidents and the changing of the judiciary, there is this balance between the momentary perception of what needs to be done and the more elementary articulation of what the principles are by which we all live.
Well, that's I think that's a lovely tribute to the Supreme Court, and
well,
very moving.
I think we have to have some confidence in our institutions, because I would say this, that whatever defects you can ascribe to the Supreme Court, you can ascribe to the other 2 branches equally, and maybe in a greater degree. Let's look at the President and the Congress, equally troubled by our times.
I am
So what I'm saying is that we need a tolerance. What we need is a tolerance for the deficiencies of our own institutions. And wherever we go, it's very easy to point to the presidency, to point to the Congress, and to point to the court. Now, I would prefer a little more toleration for our 3 branches of government, or I don't think this country is going to make it.
I think we should have much more intoleration for our institutions. I think our institutions have let us down. I think the Supreme Court has made some lousy decisions. I think Congress merits the low esteem in which it is held. I think that the overwhelming majority of the American politicians speak pap and attempt to please people for the sake of their own aggrandizement, and that our institutions are in very lousy shape. Now, I'm syntactically resourceful, but I couldn't begin to use a judgment to criticize the Supreme Court that could equal in intensity the condemnations of the court by members of it. If you were to collect the minority opinions of the last 15 years by associate justices of the Supreme Court, all right, I start with 15, take 15. But 15, we've had the activist court, which is why I thought it more relevant to talk about them. I couldn't begin, as I say, to express the kind of learned contempt of, say, Justice Frankfurter for most of the 5-4 decisions of the Warren
Although you'll
Court.
find that Justice Frankfurter, when he wanted, he was quite capable of writing his own statute. If you look at some of the labor law decisions...
If you're saying he was inconsistent, I say sure.
He was very inconsistent. He was able, with his brilliant mind, to put anything he wanted into his constitutional adjudication. And certainly he raised the cry against the one-man, one-vote and a number of the decisions.
Sure.
But when it came to other things, he was quite activist, and especially the Fourth Amendment, he was stretching that even beyond Justice Black.
He was a late learner, which most liberals, by definition, are.
What's that?
He was a late learner, yeah. But now,
Thomas Aquinas was a late learner too. Did you know? They used to call him the dumb ox. And I think...
No, he was called a dumb ox only by Charles I, who. Even at age 16...
Would you call him a liberal or a conservative?
The essence of the conservative. Absolutely, the essence of the conservative.
Actually, he was quite liberal, because at the time, he made a reconciliation between the pagan philosophies of that time and the ecclesiastical theories that were obtaining.
That's extremely conservative, because he absorbed them and sort of leached them of that which was heretical. No, not so much co-opted. That would have been much too, I think that would have been too serpentine for St. Thomas. He baptized them.
He christened them, maybe.
Yeah, sure. But talking about what I consider to be a basic contrary, you say the American people will have their way. But the answer is that they can't have their way in a climate in which they want contradictory things. the first law of logic in anybody's religion is the law of contradiction, right?
Now, that's Aristotelian logic.
Yeah, that's what
There's
I said.
other theories. Yeah. Mr. Korzybski has what he calls non-Aristotelian logic.
I said the first
you
law
have
of logic.
Eastern logic,
3,000
which
years
embraces
separates
contradiction.
Korzybski and Aristotle.
You have Mr. Whitman,
who
just embraces self-contradiction.
No, it's quite true that people live at different levels of rationality, and some even achieve heights from which a strange dialectical complementarity becomes plausible.
And I might say that
but it's also true that the average American politician is telling the American people every day that they can have two things that are irreconcilable.
I want to ask you a question.
They can tell them, for instance, they can have total freedom, but that we must raise their taxes.
You raised the point about contradiction. Yeah. What do you think of, I like your comment on a statement of Tertullian, who stated his philosophy as credo quia absurdum.
Well, I think he was making a point of primary poetic impact. That which is absurd.
Isn't that a recognition of the inherent contradiction of the human condition?
No. He was talking about his own epistemological preferences, to which every man is entitled. But Tertullian certainly never wrote a constitution, and it would be very difficult for us to be guided by a Tertullian philosophy on any general scale. You can do it solipsistically, but you can't do it for an entire society. Now,
no, but it recognizes the inherent contradiction.
When you say that the American people are going to have what they want, I say to you, they can't have what they want if they want contradictory things. For instance,
not
education.
At the same time.
They were brought up to believe that the more education they had, A, the brighter they would be, and B, the better off they would be. All of a sudden we find out that the more money we spend on schools, the less we are actually educating.
There's an inflation occurring in the academic
Even you found that out recently. You found out
well, I stayed in school until I was 27. I don't know whether that was a positive or negative factor.
I don't know either. but it is true that you're finding out, as governor, for instance, that it costs $2,000 a year to maintain a child in a day center.
No, but almost, in some cases, $3,000.
In some cases, and this came as a considerable shock to you, right? Which caused a modification in your pre-electoral rhetoric, on which I congratulate you, what I would call a practical limit of liberalism. But is it not true that you've got to say to the people of New York, you can't stop inflation and live lives that depend on spending more money than, in fact, is generated by the GNP. Well, this is an iron law of sorts.
If you want the iron law, that conjures up unpleasant illusions from England, but there is a law of reality, a law of limits that no one gives what he does not have. You can't draw out of something what isn't there in some fashion.
No, you can take it away from people.
You can take away if they have something.
If the government prints money and distributes it in this room, we've got legal tender. But it is a fact that everybody else has slightly less than he had before.
Well, leaving monetary questions aside for just a moment, I'd like to, we can get into that if you want. If what you mean in the practical limits of liberalism, there is a sensibility and an imagination in this country that stems possibly from our history, that we face a limitless expanse, that we have a manifest destiny to expand to infinity.
Right.
And that may be true in some spiritual
and
sense.
To have total freedom and total security.
And that is absolutely
total
true.
freedom of speech and a sense of standards and so on and so forth.
This freedom is totally impossible without limits, without structure, spontaneity without discipline. All these things follow. And the fact is that there are limits to the planet. There are limits to a board, a commission, to a government. There are problems that cannot be solved. There are people who are incapable of certain tasks, who cannot run the 100-yard dash in 8 seconds, or who cannot work out a quadratic equation. There are people who cannot paint. There are
societies
people who
that can't find
lathe.
jobs for PhDs.
There are.
As you pointed out recently, there are a lot of PhDs in India who don't have jobs.
They play chess, I'm told.
They play chess, you were told. Yeah, you told me. Now, why is that? Why is that?
Because
it isn't because there is a surplus in India of highly educated talent. In fact, there's a great dearth of it. It is because of something else, right?
Because there's a discrepancy between the end and the means. And if you set forth as a goal the solving of a problem, that doesn't mean you're going to solve it. If you have a problem and the problem is ignorance or the problem is unemployment, education may not be the solution to that. Right. A manpower training provides jobs for the train-or, not the trainee.
Yeah,
a pedigree does not produce a job.
A major insight.
But a job may produce a pedigree.
But this is a major insight. This would have been denounced as heretical by the National Association, Educational Association. In fact, it probably still is. But
well, I vetoed a bill.
2 or 3 years ago.
I vetoed a bill this week that would have required a college degree to write a particular, to have the competency to write a particular report in one of our government institutions. And I did so because I felt that there was no particular...
That's the euthanasia of an entire class.
There was no particular necessary relationship. It may be helpful, it may not. And there is a credentialization...
You said that they could have a college degree without being able to write a paper, or you said that they couldn't...
That in the absence of such a degree, it may well be that they could perform an excellent job as required by their position. And
sure. In other words, that they shouldn't be required to have a college degree to qualify for any particular job. I couldn't agree with you more.
It's a way, the college degree is a way of sorting in the society, but if you look at what learning is, learning teaches you to learn. Education provides its own justification in that it gives you the intellectual tools to think clearly.
Yeah.
It may or may not have anything to do with getting a job, and it should not be justified.
Or finding solutions.
Or finding a solution, because in fact there may be no solution other than acceptance.
But it ought to teach you about irreconcilable, shouldn't it? And it ought to have a chastening effect on the overblown rhetoric of what we consider to be typical politicians' rhetoric, right?
Well, if by that you mean Pollyanna optimism and the negation of thousands of years...
No more wars in this century kind of stuff.
Well, I think that any historical examination will show that every civilization that has risen has also fallen. Do you need to say any more? I mean, there are requirements to maintain one's position. Human nature being constant, one can just take it from there. And there is a failure to recognize the limits of human nature. I think combined with that, I think one has to have a vision of the tremendous unmet capacity that we have. But that capacity may not lie just in the material realm. It may be that we have to see our role in a more spiritual or intellectual domain. Is
it your opinion that the government's role has been overestimated in the last generation as the catalytic agent for bringing out the resources of those people whose resources have not been sufficiently utilized?
Say that, just would you...
What do you think? Most people in the last 20, 30 years have thought that the government is necessarily the agent that harnesses the skills and the abilities that are otherwise unutilized.
It may well be the agent, but the question is who is the principal manipulating the agent. And unfortunately, once this relationship of agency is created, there are many, it takes on a life of its own. And the idea that government has some omnipotence or omniscience is completely absurd and counter to all the thinking that went into this country. There are many things that cannot be solved. There are many things that lie beyond or beneath government. And there is an overblown rhetoric and an overblown expectation that if there is a problem, there must be a program to solve it.
Right.
I think that, in many ways, is the lesson of Vietnam. We were beaten not because we lacked technology, not because we didn't have the hardware, not because we didn't have the systems analysis at the Pentagon. We lost because we lacked the political will to carry out a particular objective.
Who says A must say B?
Well, say that again.
Well, it's a famous political philosopher. If you say A, you're required to say B. If is necessarily to the realization
If
of
you
A.
would will the end, you must also will the means.
The
That was
appropriate
Mr.
means,
That
yeah.
was Mr. Aquinas.
Yeah.
But but I think that I think that there is a real lesson in Vietnam that applies to the domestic situation. The Viet Cong or the North Vietnamese or whoever, what combination of people you want to refer to, were able to beat the most powerful country in the world, at least in a material sense, because they had the vision and they had the morale and they had the will to fight and to win. And that's why they won. And many problems depend on an intangible like that, on dedication, on a principle, on a philosophy, on an idea. And an idea is more powerful than anything else. If that idea is grounded within the structure of a people, there is no stopping it. If it fits with the time. And that's is what I see, that here we are at the top. We are now faced with a position of where do we go? And we are living within an illusion that one can reduce our defense appropriations, we can limitlessly expand our social services, that we can just let the private sector...
These irreconcilables I spoke about, yeah.
Yeah, you have to pay the price.
But Murray Kempton has said
that
the history of the post-war world will record that the two superpowers were North Vietnam and Israel. And I think he's quite right. Not certainly us and Soviet Union. Let me, before
there is an
elephantitis
that takes over. That you get so big that you can't function. And I think if you look at the classical world, as the political entity expanded its role and responsibility, it ran into problems both in Greece and Rome that it could not handle. And it was accompanied by these generalized mystical feelings that as the borders expanded, as the discipline weakened, as the decadence increased, as the classes that were in the leadership position lost their nerve, then those on the perimeter ultimately came through. And in 410, when Mr. Alaric walked through, where we had this wonderful civilization, there was grass and wild dogs wandering around. And that is not that is not a lesson that is ignored with impunity.
Yeah. Let me ask you for just 2 seconds before we turn to the to the press, Governor. By the way, the man whose name we were both trying to think of was Spencer.
Herbert Spencer.
Yeah, Herbert Spencer. I said I was talking about Sumner was his disciple, so I apologize. Can I turn just for 1 second on the philosophical political significance of the style of asceticism? I think probably the most conspicuous example of it in this century was Salazar. Nobody accused Salazar of having any appetites for the sort of Transylvanian trappings of power. He was required to consent to have pictures of himself in the post office, and he practically couldn't stand it. Now, that might have been temperamental. He thought it was more than that. He thought that he had an ongoing obligation to the people of Portugal to diminish his own role constantly, to remind them that he was their servant, not their lord. And yet it seems to be contrary to historical experience that the people want that. They seem to have vicarious pleasure out of building grand state houses and monuments and white houses and parades. Whenever the Queen puts on one of those ceremonies, it becomes the wildly popular experience of all of England. And all of a sudden they think back to the 19th century. Now, have you considered this factor in the light of your own stated preference for a highly ascetic style, or did you simply lurch into it out of personal preference? Is it a part of your political philosophy, or are you simply acting out of personal preference without thinking about that aspect of it?
I don't see a real distinction there. I think, in fact, I believe that one's philosophy emerges out of what one is. And this separation of style and substance I think in some degree it's artificial, and
Well,
I live the way I try to live the way I have always lived, which is in some sense impossible in the job I have. But a simpler view of life is coming upon us. I have no doubt about that. And the accumulation of possessions and material indulgence is impossible over time because of the ecological limits imposed on this planet. I believe that to be the case.
But you're taking it to sort of Thoreauvian lengths. Now, Philip II decided towards the end of his lifetime that he had done enough in terms of public exhibitionism, and he was going to indulge himself in the Escorial, which was hardly a $250 a month apartment. But he was very, very conscious of what it was that he had done. And I'm asking simply whether you have integrated your thought into your political philosophy, your lifestyle, your political philosophy.
Well, my last apartment was less expensive, so
So you made that concession. Well, I think perhaps you have answered the question by saying that you feel that there are ecological demands that you have to symbolize by drastically reducing your consumption of the natural bounty.
Well, first of all, I don't feel altogether comfortable with certain kinds of trappings that have been there. I don't think they fit the time. They don't fit me. It's not very convenient leaving the office at 12 or 1 o'clock in the morning to drive 20 minutes to an empty 12-bedroom or 12-room mansion. You know, what am I going to do? Sit out there and wander around?
Count
like,
the silver?
Well, what's the point?
Yeah.
It just doesn't fit in to the reality in which I find myself. I do think that to the extent that what I'm doing has some basic connection with where we're going in this country, it can symbolize the restraint and the limits that all people are up against. The idea of exploiting this country in its resources, in its government bureaucracies and programs has to be tempered. There's another side to life. You have to be optimistic and visionary, but there's a darker side, a tragic side that cannot be overturned. And there is a limit, and if you exceed that limit, there is an inevitable reaction. And I think this country has to come to terms with its limits and to make its choices. And a choice implies that you give up one thing and you take another. And that's all there is to it.
So therefore it is highly intentional what you have done. It isn't entirely eccentric. It is a part of your integrated political philosophy.
That's
on how governors should live, using governors as a generic word.
Well, I think it has another, I don't accept those adjectives in quite that way, but government, as you mentioned, you gave a pretty low estimation of its present performance. I don't think it fits very well for those in politics to be whining and dining and congratulating themselves in a ritual of affluence and excess when juxtaposed to the poverty of their performance. We're not doing that well. So I don't think we're in a position to indulge ourselves as though we were the great leaders or the great performers. I think the modesty of our lives ought to match the modesty of our performance.
It's an appropriate mortification.
It's appropriate?
I say an appropriate mortification.
Well, I think it is consistent with our performance.
Yeah. Mr. Manuel Valencia is with the Sacramento ABI. Mr. Valencia.
Mr. Governor Brown, a question on the farm labor issue. You recently criticized President Ford for being, quote, a president who cannot lead or will not lead. But what about your own leadership? We have recently seen massive charges and counter-charges of election violations on the farm labor union representation issue. Even Walter Kintz, the general counsel for the Agricultural Labor Relations Board, has been under fire. In short, there's been an awful lot of confusion, an awful lot of bitterness and distrust, an awful lot of chaos throughout it all, you have really said relatively little, almost nothing. Do we also...
Has that confused, does that surprise you?
Well, my question is this. I guess it doesn't surprise me. What does surprise me is this. Does California also have a governor that does not know or want to lead, at least on this issue?
Well, after 10 years of trying, we have a farm labor board. We have a process that is in the works, that is working, that has conducted 150 elections in 30 days, when compared with the NLRB that conducted 200 in the space of a year after gearing up for 2 years with 1,000 people. We have sent people out into the fields and into the offices to conduct an unprecedented number of elections under unprecedented conditions in a sector of our country that has never been before regulated in this manner. And this again raises the practical limits of whatever government does. Because there is a problem, and because there is antagonism, confusion, and bitterness and aspiration and all the other things that go into this farm labor question, the fact is that there is no deus ex machina that can drop down and solve it in 1 month. There is a mechanism in place that I am confident will work over time. Recently, there has been added to it a strike force that will bring together trial lawyers to try to unclog the system, to make it go forward as expeditiously as possible and bring justice to all the participants. But to think that merely by signing a piece of paper and creating a board with the members and a general counsel and a few field offices, that you can resolve the disputes of decades is a premise that just doesn't face the reality that we have to deal with. And that board and the general counsel's office and the regional boards, they're doing yeoman service, and together with the strike force that is now adding a new dimension of enforcement and expeditious quality to the whole matter, I'm confident that it will work. And to think that there will not be charges from every side is to misread the methodology of the participants. This is an economic struggle, and it's an economic struggle that will manifest itself as all economic struggles. And part of the manner in which that occurs is in charges, is in statements, and you will see that. But over time, we have brought law to the fields. But law, like all the other institutions, depend on fallible human beings. And given all that, this thing is working well.
Mr. Bruce, Keppel is the editor of the California Journal. Mr. Keppel?
Yes, in this field of farm labor relations, certainly your administration, Governor, has gotten high marks for putting together a very difficult series of negotiations and coming out with an act, which is now in place. And another area related to that is collective bargaining for public employees. That, too, has been perking through the legislature for quite some time in California. We've had an increasing number of strikes in the public sector. However, that effort failed in this year when it should have, many observers had thought at the outset, passed. And you expressed being in favor of collective bargaining under certain constraints for public employees. The question I have is...
For us non-Californians, is that the San Francisco police?
There was the San Francisco police strike in particular, which seemed to be germane to this, but there were many others.
That followed the failure of the law to be enacted.
There were a number of others. There's a problem of reconciling disputes. Question is, some people, certainly within the legislature now, wonder whether, if you were for this, if your leadership in March rather than in June might not have made the difference of pushing this law through this year.
Well, I'm not a prophet or an historian, so I can't really tell you, but I will say this, that there is a balance between the executive and the legislative branch, and that has to be respected. The executive is not a magician that can wave a magic wand and make intractable problems go away. So I defer to the legislature, as I think I must under the Constitution, and problems must develop, they must ferment to a certain point when my involvement can be helpful. And I judged in that situation that the contending forces should contend, and at the point where they were unable to find a resolution, I offered my services. Now, the fact that the compromise that was arrived at by many of the parties, but by no means all, was rejected is merely a statement by the legislature that that method of resolving public employee disputes is not for this year. And that's a decision that I respect. It is based on many variables, and I think we live with it. And I don't think there's any need in any one period to to wrap up every problem. The point of government is not for all time to invent a final solution. It is a process by which the public business is conducted in an orderly fashion and justice is dispensed.
You didn't perceive
and that's a process that we're always involved in. So we're still in that process, and I don't take a short time view of this thing. I think we have to take a look at the long term, and things are proceeding apace.
Your delay then wasn't due to perceiving a change in public opinion on this matter, such as you referred to earlier, shifting public sentiment, and therefore you deferred. In the sense of maybe holding off your backing for this bill. If you had really wanted it, you could have acted sooner.
Could you answer that briefly, Governor?
Yes, well, no, as a matter of fact, I waited, and when I came in some cases, if the executive comes forward too strongly, a counter force is created, and there's got to be a balance between the executive and the legislature. And people must recognize that. The policy-making body is the legislature, and the governor is part of that. But it has to be a cooperative thing, and they did it and went through it, and at some point I entered it and I interacted, and the sum total was that the decision, except for teachers, was postponed for another year.
Mr. Glen Sparrow is the host of the Public Forum Weekly Public Affairs series on KVIE. Mr. Sparrow, we have half a minute.
Yes, Governor, you seem to indicate before that national security may depend upon vision, morale, and will of the people. I
have no doubt of that.
How does a political leader such as yourself make this happen?
15 seconds.
By speaking, I see the most important prerequisite of leadership now as clarity and honesty in the statement of where we are and where we should go and what the realistic means of attaining that are.
Thank you, Governor. Thank you, gentlemen of the press. Thank you all.
For a printed, bound transcript of this program, send $1 to Firing Line, Post Office Box 5966, Columbia, South Carolina 29250. That's $1 to Firing Line, Post Office Box 5966, Columbia, South Carolina 29250. Production funding provided by public television stations, the Ford Foundation, and the Corporation for Public Broadcasting.